22 judges agreed to take part in a study. They were told it was about personality. They were real judges. Municipal court, a large city in the American Southwest, 15 men and 7 women, people whose entire professional training is the removal of themselves from a decision. Each of them was given a packet of questionnaires and then a case file. The case was a routine one. A woman had been arrested for prostitution. The judge's job was to set bond. Half of the judges had 1 extra page in their packet. It was 2 questions long. It asked them to write down what they thought would happen to them as they physically died and what the thought of their own death made them feel. Then they set bond. In the same case, under the same law, the judges who had not answered those 2 questions set bond at $50 on average. The judges who had set it at $455, 9 times higher. Same case, same file, same law. The only difference was that some of them had been made to think for a couple of minutes about their own bodies dying, and then had been handed a stranger whose life did not look like theirs. And here is the part that matters most. Not one of them thought the questionnaire had anything to do with it. They were not aware of being influenced, because that is not how it works. They gave legal reasons. They believed their legal reasons. If you had put them under oath, they would have sworn honestly that the bond reflected the case. That study was published in 1989. It has been run in various forms hundreds of times since, on judges, on students, on soldiers, on doctors, on ordinary people in more than a dozen countries, and I am going to spend an entire section of this video on what happened when people tried to replicate it, because the honest answer is more interesting than the tidy one. But the experiment is not where this starts. The experiment was designed to test a book. The book was written by a man who was dying while he wrote it, published in 1973 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize 2 months after its author was dead. He never knew he had won it. It is called The Denial of Death, and the man who wrote it was Ernest Becker. Here is his claim in 1 sentence, and I want you to notice how strange it is. He did not say that people are afraid of dying. Everyone knows that, and it would not be worth a book. He said that the fear is so intolerable that it cannot be held in consciousness at all, that it therefore gets pushed down below the floor of ordinary awareness, and that the enormous structure you have built on top of it, the thing you experience as your ambitions, your certainties, your work, your beliefs, your taste, the person you fell in love with and the reasons you gave for it, that structure is the burial, not a reaction to the fear, the management of it, which means that the thing you call your personality is not, in Becker's account, a description of who you are. It is a defense. And it is a defense against something you are not permitted to know you are defending against, because if you knew, it would stop working. He gives that structure a name that I want you to carry through the whole of this video, because it is the hinge of everything. He calls it the vital lie of character. Vital, as in necessary to stay alive. Lie, as in not true. And then he draws the conclusion that almost every summary of this book quietly declines to draw. If character is a vital lie, then mental health is not the absence of the lie. It cannot be. Mental health, on this account, is a lie that is currently working. And the person who looks best adjusted is not the person who has seen through the most. It is the person whose defense is holding. I want to be very clear about what this video is and is not, because there is a version of this topic that is everywhere and it is not this one. There is a genre of video about this book. It is usually 20 minutes long. It summarizes the Immortality Project in about 400 words, and then it lands every single time in the same place. Accept your mortality. Live each day fully. Let the awareness of death make your life more precious. Becker does not say that. Becker specifically, explicitly, at length, refuses to say that. He thought the advice to live fully in the light of death was itself a symptom of the thing he was describing, one more way of making death into a tool for the improvement of the self, which is exactly what a person who cannot tolerate death would do with it. His book has no cure in it. It says so. The last chapter is called A Retrospect on the Dilemmas of Heroism, Not the Solutions, and the final prescription he offers is 4 lines long and gives you almost nothing. That refusal is the reason this book is still argued about 50 years later, and it is the reason it is worth 2.5 hours instead of 20 minutes. So here is what we are going to do. I am going to build his argument in the order he built it, because it is cumulative and taking any piece out of sequence makes it sound either obvious or insane. We will start with why the terror cannot be felt directly and what a very small child works out about their own body that nobody ever tells them. Then character as a vital lie, and where Becker stole that idea from, which is a play about a duck. Then the causa sui project, his rewriting of Freud, the attempt every person makes to be the cause of themselves. Then the hero system, which is his word for culture, and what happens to a society when its official ways of being significant stop convincing people. Then the chapter that I think is the best in the book, on why we hand ourselves over to strong personalities, and why he thought that was not weakness but appetite. Then the romantic solution, which is his account of what modern people do with the need for God when there is no God available, and it is about the person you are in love with, and it is not comfortable. Then the 4 layers of a person working downward, and what is at the bottom. Then what happens when the whole apparatus fails, and his reading of depression, which is not a medical reading and which I will flag clearly as his. Then the experiments, including their troubles. Then the second book, the darker one, the one he did not finish, which is where his argument stops being about your anxiety and starts being about atrocity. And then the ending. 3 things before we begin. First, about Becker himself, because his biography is not decoration here. He was born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1924 to Jewish immigrant parents. He served in the infantry in the Second World War, and he was among the soldiers involved in the liberation of a Nazi concentration camp. He was 19 or 20 years old. Everything he wrote afterwards about heroism, about how badly human beings need to feel significant, and about what that need produces when it is threatened, was written by a man who had walked through the end of that logic before he had finished being a teenager. He does not mention it in the book. It is underneath every page of it. Second, a caution about the subject. This is a work of psychology and philosophy about mortality, and I am going to treat it the way Becker treated it, as an argument. It is not medical advice and it is not therapy, and when we get to his chapter on depression, I am going to say clearly that what you are hearing is a 1970s theorist's reading, not a clinical account and not a description of anybody's diagnosis. If this material is close to you at the moment, that is a reason to take it slowly and a reason to talk to someone real. Third, I am going to tell you where he is wrong or unfalsifiable or where he helps himself to something he has not earned. There are places. A 2.5-hour case that concedes nothing is not a case, it is an advertisement, and Becker of all people would have had no patience for it. Settle in. This one is built to be watched, and it moves at the pace of the argument. We start with a fear that you have never once felt, and that has been running underneath your life since you were about 3 years old. Part 1. The terror that cannot be felt. There is an obvious objection to everything I just said, and it is worth taking seriously immediately, because if it holds, the book collapses on page 1. The objection is this: I am not afraid of death. I hardly ever think about it. When I do think about it, I feel something fairly mild, a sort of abstract unease that passes in about 4 seconds, and then I go and make a coffee. If there were a terror underneath my whole personality, surely I would have noticed. Becker's answer to that is the foundation of the entire book, and he takes it from a psychiatrist named Gregory Zilberg, writing in the 1940s. Zilberg's point is almost mathematical. If the fear of death were constantly present in your conscious mind, you could not function. Not, would not, could not. You would not cross a road. You would not board a plane. You would not have children. You would not invest 6 years in a qualification. You would not fall asleep. An organism carrying a permanently conscious awareness of its own annihilation cannot do the things that organisms have to do. So the capacity to feel that terror continuously is not a feature that survives in any sense you like. Therefore, Zilberg says, and Becker follows him, the fear must be present and hidden at the same time. Present, because the animal knows. Hidden, because a functioning animal cannot know it all day. Now notice what that does to the objection. The absence of the feeling is not evidence against the theory. On this account, the absence of the feeling is exactly what the theory predicts. If you were walking around consciously terrified, that would be the anomaly. This is the point at which a careful person should feel a small alarm bell, and I want to ring it myself rather than wait for the comments. An argument that treats its own absence of evidence as confirmation is doing something suspicious. If feeling the fear proves the theory, and not feeling the fear also proves the theory, then what could possibly disprove it? That is a real problem, and it is the standard philosophical objection to this book, and Becker does not fully answer it. Hold on to it. It is the main reason the experiments in Part 9 matter so much, because they are the attempt to make the claim testable by people who came after him. But before we get to whether it is true, we have to get it clearly, because most people who dismiss this book have dismissed a cartoon of it. Becker's picture starts with a child, and with something he thinks every child works out and no adult remembers working out. A small child does not begin life knowing it will die. What it begins with is a body. And at some point, fairly early, the child makes a discovery about that body which Becker thinks is the founding trauma of being a person. And it is not sexual, and it is not about the parents. It is that the body is an animal. It is a thing that hungers and leaks and gets sick and is not under your command. It does things you did not authorize. It can be hurt. It obeys rules you did not write and cannot amend. And the child is, at the same moment, a being with a symbolic inner life, enormous, unbounded. A creature that can imagine anything, name anything, be a king in the afternoon, hold the whole world in its head. So you get the paradox Becker builds everything on, a symbolic self of no fixed limits, housed in a body of very fixed limits, and joined to it permanently. Something that can conceive of eternity, attached to something that will stop. He describes the human being as a god who nonetheless goes back into the ground, food for worms, and says that this is the specific horror of us. Not that we die, which the animals do, that we are the animal that knows, and that the knowing arrives inside a creature that also feels infinite. Every other animal is safely inside its own nature. We are the only ones sticking out of it. Now, a genuine caution, because this is exactly the sort of claim that gets repeated as fact. Becker is not reporting a developmental study when he describes what the child works out. He is doing psychoanalytic reconstruction in the idiom of his period, working from rank and from the clinical literature of the time. Modern developmental research on when and how children understand death is a live field with a lot of variation in it, and it does not simply confirm what he says. Take his account as the picture the argument needs, and hold it loosely, because nothing later in the book depends on the exact age. It is also worth saying that Becker did not invent the observation. He is very clear that he did not, and the honesty is one of his better qualities. The core perception is old. Montaigne wrote that to philosophize is to learn to die. 400 years before any of this, Pascal, in the 1660s, described the human being as a thinking reed, the weakest thing in nature but one that knows it is being crushed, which is very nearly Becker's paradox in a single image. And he went further and said that the whole reason people fill their days with distraction and business and entertainment is that they cannot bear to sit alone in a room with the fact. That is Becker's thesis, 3 centuries early, from a man who was also dying young while he wrote it. So what is new here? What is new is the mechanism. Montaigne and Pascal are describing a condition and recommending a posture toward it. Becker is claiming something structurally different, which is that the avoidance is not a moral failure or a bad habit, but the organizing principle of the personality operating below awareness, producing the specific shape of a specific person. Pascal says you distract yourself because you cannot face it. Becker says the distraction has hardened into who you are, and you can no longer tell the difference between your defenses and your preferences. That is the step. It converts a moral observation into a psychology, and everything after this depends on it holding. What the later argument does depend on is the shape of the solution, so let us get to it. The child cannot tolerate the paradox. Nobody can. The response is repression, and Becker is careful about what he means by that word because he is using it in a way Freud did not. For Freud, the great repression, the thing pushed under, was desire, sexuality, what the child wants and may not have. For Becker, that is the wrong candidate, and the whole of the middle of this book is an argument that psychoanalysis spent 70 years excavating the second most important thing. The great repression is mortality, creatureliness, the body. And in Becker's rewriting, the famous Freudian material is not primary at all, it is a screen. It is easier to be tormented about desire than to be tormented about being a perishable animal, and a mind will take the survivable torment every time. That reversal is the intellectual center of the book, and when we get to the chapter where he takes Freud's own life apart to make the case, he is doing something quite aggressive, which is using the founder's own method on the founder. But repression on its own is not a solution. It is only a flaw. Push the terror down, and you have a hole where your certainty about your own significance ought to be, and a hole is unstable. Something has to be built on it, and it has to be built at once, and it has to be built out of whatever material the world is offering. So the child does not merely bury the knowledge. The child begins immediately to construct a way of being that makes the buried thing unnecessary to think about, a way of being safe, a way of being good, a way of being the kind of person that this does not happen to, or does not fully happen to, or happens to last. That construction is what Becker means by character. And I want to slow down on the word because in ordinary English it is a compliment, a person of character, strength of character. We use it to mean the reliable core, the part of somebody that is genuinely them, the part that shows when conditions are hard. Becker means the opposite. In this book, character is the shape the fear left. It is not what remains when the defenses come down, it is the defenses. The reliability we admire in it is the reliability of a wall. Wilhelm Reich had a phrase for this, and Becker uses it. Character armor. Not a metaphor for being guarded in conversation. A structure laid down early, held in the body, and the habits and the reflexes that determines in advance which parts of reality are allowed to reach you. Because that is the thing about armor. It does not distinguish. It stops the arrow and it stops everything else at the same time. Whatever protects you from the terror is going to protect you from a great deal of ordinary life on the way past, and the price of not being flooded is not being reached. Which sets up the question that the rest of this book is really about. If character is armor, and armor is a lie, what happens to a person who takes it off? Becker's answer, and he is completely unsentimental about it, is that they do not become free. They become ill. And that is where we are going next. into the chapter he named after the thing itself, human character as a vital lie, and into the play about a duck that gave him the idea. Part 2. Human character as a vital lie. In 1884, Henrik Ibsen wrote a play called The Wild Duck, and it contains an idea that Becker took and made clinical. The play is about a family that is living on a set of comfortable falsehoods. A man believes things about his marriage, his daughter, and his own talent that are not true. And into this household comes a man with a mission, a truth-teller, who believes that these people are being poisoned by illusion and that what they need is the facts. He is not cruel. He is not lying. He is right about the facts, and he tells them out of principle because he believes people have a right to stand on solid ground. The play is what happens next, and what happens next is a catastrophe. And Ibsen puts into the mouth of another character the idea that Becker builds a chapter on. That the illusions are not decoration on the life, they are the load-bearing structure of it. Take the life lie away from an average person, and you take away their happiness in the same movement. Because for most people, the lie is what the happiness was made of. Becker's word for this is the vital lie, and his contribution is to say that it is not a family's peculiar arrangement. It is the human arrangement. It is what a character is. Now, this is the point where people usually reach for a comfortable reading, so let me close it off. The comfortable reading says, so we all have our illusions. How humbling, how wise. Let us be gentle with one another. That is not what he is saying. He is saying something with much sharper edges, and it has 3 parts, and each one costs you something. The first is that the lie is not optional and not shameful. It is what allows a person to get out of bed. Becker has no interest in scolding anybody for having one. A creature that has to act in the world decisively, in a body that is going to fail, requires an operating fiction about its own solidity. Without it, you do not act. The second is that the lie is invisible from the inside, necessarily. A defense you can see is not doing its job. This is why you cannot simply introspect your way to it, and why the confident feeling that you personally do not have one is precisely what having one feels like. And the third is the sharp one. If character is a vital lie, then the ordinary markers of psychological health are markers of a functioning defense, not of contact with reality. Which means that the well-adjusted person and the person who sees clearly are not the same person and may not even be able to be the same person. Becker is quite willing to follow that where it goes. He notes the awkward fact that the people who have seen furthest into this in his account have very often not been well. That clarity about the human situation and comfort in it seem to trade against each other. He does not present this as inspiring, he presents it as a cost. Let me make the abstraction concrete, because this is the point in the book where it either lands in your own life or stays a theory. Think about a person who is rigid about being right, not occasionally stubborn, structurally unable to be wrong, in a way that damages their relationships and that they experience as integrity. The ordinary explanation is ego, or arrogance, or bad manners. Becker's reading is that being right is where this person's solidity is stored. Their sense that they are a real and durable thing in the world is bound up in the reliability of their judgment. So an argument is not an argument. An argument is an attempt to remove the flaw, and the intensity of their response, which looks so wildly disproportionate to everybody else in the room, is exactly proportionate to what is actually at stake, which is not the point under discussion. Or take the opposite person, the one who cannot bear conflict, who agrees too fast, who is loved for being easy. Same machinery, different design. Their solidity is stored in being needed and being liked, and the withdrawal of warmth reads to them the way exposure reads to the first person. Both of them will tell you they are simply being themselves. That is the report the defense generates. Once you have the shape, you start seeing it everywhere. And I want to warn you about that, because it is the characteristic disease of this book. It explains everything, which means that in a strict sense it predicts nothing. A theory that can absorb any behavior whatever, including behaviors that are opposites of each other, is not doing the work we usually ask theories to do. Keep that beside you. It is a genuine weakness, and it is not answered by how well the readings land. What Becker does have, and what makes the framework more than a party trick, is the account of what happens when the lie is removed. Because there is a version of this idea in the culture that says the goal is to see through your illusions. Strip away the false self. Live without armor. Be authentic. It is the operating premise of a very large amount of modern advice. Becker says no, and his no is the most useful thing in the chapter. He argues that what stands behind the character structure is not a truer, freer person waiting to be released. What stands behind it is the terror, undiluted, and the human being's actual relationship to a universe that did not have them in mind. He points at what happens to people who lose their defenses, not by choice but by collapse, and observes that they do not report liberation. They report the world becoming unbearably vivid and unbearably close. Meanings that were safely settled come loose. The ordinary furniture of a day, which everybody else moves through without noticing, becomes enormous. So the goal cannot be no lie. The goal, if there is one, has to be something else, and the whole back half of the book is spent looking for it, and the answer when it comes is very modest. There is one more move in this chapter, and it is the one people find hardest. So I want to state it plainly. Becker treats the ordinary, contented, healthy-minded life as an achievement of successful repression, not as a lesser thing, as an achievement, and one that most of us are not in a position to look down on. But he is unwilling to call it clear-sightedness, and he refuses to flatter the alternative either. He does not say the anxious see truly and the calm are asleep. That would be the flattering version, the one that lets an unhappy person feel superior, and Becker cuts it off in advance. Being tormented is not an achievement, and the neurotic in his account is not a hero of perception. They are somebody whose defense is working badly, which is a misfortune, not an insight. That even-handedness is worth something. It is the difference between this book and the shelf of books it superficially resembles. So where does that leave the picture so far? There is a terror that cannot be held in consciousness. It gets buried. On top of the burial, a character is built out of whatever the world offered, and it works, and it is invisible, and it costs you contact with a great deal of reality in exchange for the ability to function. And now the obvious question: what is the character actually for? Not what it defends against. What is it trying to achieve? Becker's answer is the most ambitious idea in the book, and it is the one that explains why a person will destroy their own life to protect a belief, why organizations behave the way they do, why people will die for a flag, and why you feel what you feel when your work is criticized. He says that every human being is engaged all the time in an attempt to be the cause of themselves, to be self-created, to be, in a sense, that the body flatly contradicts their own father and mother. The philosophers had a phrase for that idea, borrowed from theology, where it was one of the names for God. Causa sui, the cause of itself. Part 3. The cause of itself. Causa sui is a phrase out of medieval theology. It means the thing that is the cause of its own existence, the thing that does not depend on anything else in order to be. It was a description of God. It was, for a long time, understood to be the one property that separates God from everything that is not God, because every other thing in the universe was caused by something and can therefore be uncaused. Becker's claim is that every human being runs a causa sui project, not consciously, not as a belief, as a program. Here is what he means. You did not choose to exist. You were made by two people out of material you did not select and installed in a body that came with a schedule. Everything about your origin says dependent, contingent, produced, temporary, and the symbolic self inside that body cannot accept it. So it sets out to author itself, to become the sort of thing that is not merely the output of a process, but the source of one. You do this by making something that did not exist before, and that carries your signature. A body of work, a business, a reputation, a doctrine, a house, a family line, a perfect record, a style, a rule you live by that nobody imposed on you. And what all of these have in common is that they are attempts to convert a cause thing into a causing thing, to get on the other side of the arrow. Becker is rewriting Freud here quite deliberately, and it is worth seeing exactly what he does, because it is the most technically interesting move in the book. Freud's picture of the child's development is famously a drama about the parents, about desire, about rivalry and prohibition, and the internalizing of authority. Becker does not deny the drama. He says the drama is real and the interpretation of it is wrong. What the child is actually doing underneath all that material is trying to get free of the fact of having been made. The rivalry with the parent is not fundamentally about possession, it is about origin. The child wants not to have come from anywhere. It wants to be its own source. And every step of growing up is an attempt to establish independent existence against the evidence. Which means, in Becker's version, that the entire Freudian apparatus is a set of symptoms of something Freud himself would not look at. And to make that case, he does something audacious in Chapter 6. He turns the method on Freud personally, examines Freud's own well-documented peculiarities about death, the fainting episodes, the superstitions about dates, the difficulty with rivals and successors, and argues that the founder of psychoanalysis was managing exactly the terror his own system had no place for. Whether you think that is fair or a cheap shot is a real question, and reasonable readers split on it. What is not in doubt is that Becker knew precisely what he was doing. Now, the Causa Sui project has a problem, and it is a fatal one. It cannot work. You are, in fact, caused. The body will produce the evidence on schedule, and no achievement changes the fact. So the project needs a second stage, and the second stage is where this stops being abstract. If you cannot actually be self-created, you can attach yourself to something that outlasts you and take your significance from it. If the thing you are part of does not die, then in some real and felt sense the part of you that matters does not die either. This is the idea the book is famous for. Becker calls it the Immortality Project. And when he says immortality, he does not mean an afterlife, although an afterlife is one version. He means something much broader and much more ordinary. He means any arrangement by which a mortal creature gets to feel that it is participating in something that does not end. The obvious ones are the religious ones, and they are the honest ones, in the sense that they say what they are doing. Beyond those, the field is enormous. The nation is one. The company is one, which is why people who would not describe themselves as ideological about anything will give 20 years and their health to an organization and be devastated when it restructures. The family name is one. The discipline is one, which is why an academic will fight over a footnote in a way that looks insane from outside the field and perfectly reasonable inside it. Money is one, and money is a particularly powerful one because it is significance in the abstract, convertible into any other kind. A body of work is one, a cause is one, a subculture is one, a follower count is one, and it is a very poor one, and we will come back to why. Becker's next step is the one that makes this a theory of culture rather than a theory of individuals. He says that a society is, among other things, the standard list. Culture is the set of immortality projects a given time and places agree to honor. It tells you what counts as a life that mattered. It supplies the scoring system, and it does this so completely and so early that its scoring system feels to you like a perception of reality rather than a local arrangement. He calls it the hero system, and I want to be careful with that word too, because it does not mean what it sounds like. A hero system is not about doing brave things. It is the culturally supplied answer to the question of how a person earns the feeling that their existence was not trivial. Every society has one. They are wildly different from each other. In one place, it is holiness. In another, it is land. In another, it is grandchildren. In another, it is a number in a bank. In another, it is having been correct about something in public. And in every case, the people inside it experience their own version, not as one option among many, but as what a good life obviously is. Now hold those two things together, because the combination is the engine of the whole book. Every person needs to feel their life is not nothing. The rules for achieving that come from outside them, from a culture that they did not choose and cannot easily see. Which means the most private thing about you, your sense of your own worth, is manufactured to a specification you were handed, and you will defend that specification when it is challenged with a violence that has nothing to do with the merits of the argument, because what is at stake is not the argument. This is where Becker's account starts to earn its keep, because it explains a set of things that ordinary psychology explains badly. It explains why people become strange about status in ways that make them miserable and that they cannot stop. It explains why retirement destroys some people and not others, and why the ones it destroys are often the ones who are most admired for their commitment. It explains why criticism of your work does not feel like information. It explains why somebody will choose the version of a story that makes them significant over the version that makes them happy. And it explains the specific quality of modern unease, which Becker was writing about in the early 1970s and which has not improved. His diagnosis of modernity is that the traditional hero systems have lost their power to convince, and nothing of equal weight has replaced them. The religious ones no longer command belief for a very large number of people. The national ones are compromised by history. The vocational ones have been thinned out by work that visibly does not matter. And so people are left with the same need and no adequate way to meet it, and they attempt to meet it privately, in the self, on their own account. Becker's judgment on that is bleak and worth hearing carefully. He thought the private self was far too small an object to carry the weight. A hero system works partly because it is bigger than any individual and outlives them. A project of personal fulfillment has neither property. It is a container the same size as the thing it is supposed to contain, and when it fails, there is nothing outside it to appeal to. Which is why, he says, when the public systems weaken, people do not stop needing to be significant, they go looking for something to attach to. And the two things nearest to hand are another person and a strong personality who seems to know we are going to take both of those, because they are the two best chapters in the book. But before we do, there is an obligation to discharge. Becker has just accused psychoanalysis of spending 70 years digging in the wrong place. That is a serious charge, and he does not leave it as an assertion. He goes after the man who founded it, using the man's own method, and then he goes and retrieves somebody the movement threw away. That chapter is the most aggressive thing in the book, and it is where the theory gets tested on the people who built it. Part 4. The Founder's Own Defense. Becker has now made a very large claim about Freud. He has said that psychoanalysis spent 70 years excavating the wrong repression, that the buried material is not desire, It is mortality, and that the sexual drama Freud built a science on is a screen in front of it. That is not a small thing to say about the founder of the field you are borrowing from, and Becker knows it. So in Chapter 6, he does something that I still find startling. He turns the method on the man. The chapter is called The Problem of Freud's Character. And the argument is that if you want to know why psychoanalysis has a hole where death should be, you should look at the person who built it using the tools he invented. And the material is there. Freud fainted at least twice in the presence of Carl Jung. The first time was in Bremen in 1909, shortly before the two of them sailed for America. They were at lunch. Jung had become interested in a set of prehistoric bodies recovered from peat bogs, and he was talking about them at length over the meal. Corpses, preserved bodies. That is what the conversation was about when Freud went down. The second time was in Munich in 1912, during a discussion of a paper about an Egyptian pharaoh. Freud's own interpretation afterwards, which he gave to Jung directly, was that Jung harbored a death wish against him. Now, hold that at arm's length for a second and look at the shape of it. The man who taught the world to read a slip, a dream, a symptom as a message from below, collapses twice. In the presence of the younger man everyone assumed would inherit the movement, and one of those times he collapses while somebody describes bodies to him. And his reading of the event is that the danger is in the other person. Becker's suggestion is that Freud was managing his own terror with the only instrument available to a man of his temperament, which was the theory, and that the theory had to remain his, unamended, because it was not simply an account of the mind, it was his immortality project. And an immortality project cannot be edited by other people without ceasing to do its job. Which would explain the thing that is otherwise very strange about the early history of psychoanalysis, and that is usually told as a series of personality clashes. Look at the pattern. Adler goes, Jung goes, Rank goes, Ferenczi is pushed to the margin. In every case, the break is over a proposed amendment, and in every case the amendment is treated not as a disagreement, but as a betrayal, complete with a formal apparatus of loyalty. There was an actual inner circle, with an actual name, the committee, and its members were given actual rings. Becker's point is not that Freud was a small man. He is very clear that Freud was not. His point is that the machinery he is describing does not exempt the person who discovered half of it, and that a movement organized around the defense of one man's account of the mind is doing something the account itself should have been able to explain. Whether that is a fair reading is a real question. There is a version of this that is just clever, and Becker occasionally comes close to it. The unfalsifiability problem I will come back to at the end bites hardest right here, because once you are permitted to interpret a man's fainting spells as evidence for your theory of what he was avoiding, you can prove anything about anybody. Hold that objection. It is the correct one to hold. But now I want to take you to the person this chapter is really clearing space for, because Becker's other great act in this book is a rescue, and the man he rescues is almost unknown outside the field. Otto Rank was not a minor figure. Freud appointed him secretary of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1906 when Rank was 22 and had no medical degree and no university position. He was Freud's assistant for the better part of 2 decades. He sat in the innermost circle. He ran the publishing house. He co-edited both of the movement's journals, and for years he was as close to Freud as anybody outside the family. In 1924, he published a book called The Trauma of Birth, and it ended him. The argument, roughly, was that the founding human anxiety is not the Oedipal drama, but the separation at birth, the expulsion from a state of complete unity into a state of exposure. Freud hesitated and then distanced himself, and the signal went round the circle that Rank was close to heresy. Rank resigned his positions. The vice presidency, the publishing house, both journals. He went to Paris and then to America, and was written out of the movement so thoroughly that he became a footnote in a story he had helped to write. He kept working. In 1932 he published Art and Artist, which is the book Becker leans on hardest, and which is about the artist as a person who tries to solve the problem of mortality by making an object that outlives them, and about what that solution costs the person who attempts it. Rank died in New York on the 31st of October, 1939. 5 weeks after Freud died in London. He had been married 3 months. It was a kidney infection that turned septic. Becker's judgment on him is unqualified. He treats Rank not as a dissident from psychoanalysis, but as its completion. The person who took the inquiry to the place Freud could not go, and who was expelled for approximately that reason. A great deal of what people credit to Becker is Rank, and Becker says so on nearly every page, which is one of the more attractive things about him as a writer. And there is a symmetry here that I do not think Becker could have arranged if he tried. Rank proposed that the founding trauma is separation, exposure, the loss of a state where you were held. Becker proposed that it is mortality, the knowledge of ending. And if you stand back far enough, these are the same traumas seen from the two ends. Being cast out of a unity and being scheduled to return to one, life fear and death fear, which is Rank's own pair, and which we will get to. 2 men, both writing about the terror of being a separate, perishable thing. One expelled from his intellectual family for saying it, the other dying while he wrote it down. So we now have the full apparatus. A terror that cannot be held, a character built over it, a causa sui project that cannot succeed, a hero system supplying the rules, and a tradition of psychology that, on Becker's reading, was itself organized as a defense against the very thing it should have been studying, which leaves the question of what a person actually does with all this pressure day to day in an ordinary life. And the answer is that they find somebody to hand it to. Part 5. The spell cast by persons. Chapter 7 of this book has a subtitle that tells you what it is about before you start: the nexus of unfreedom. It is about transference, and I need to explain what that word means in the technical sense, because the everyday use of it has drifted a long way from the thing. In its original psychoanalytic sense, transference is what happens when a patient begins to relate to their analyst as though the analyst was somebody else. The feelings that belong to a parent, a rival, a lost figure, get moved onto the person in the room. The classical reading of this is that it is a regression. The patient is going backwards, reproducing a childhood pattern, and the work of the therapy is to make that visible so it can stop. Becker says that reading is not merely incomplete, it is upside down. And his argument is one of the genuinely original things in the book. And it is the reason I would recommend this chapter to somebody who was never going to read the rest. He points out that transference is not confined to therapy at all. People do it constantly, everywhere. To bosses, to teachers, to leaders, to doctors, to celebrities, to whoever in the room seems most certain. It is not a symptom that appears under clinical conditions. It is a permanent feature of how human beings organize themselves, and any account that treats it as a malfunction is going to have to explain why the malfunction is universal. So what is it for? Becker's answer follows from everything we have built. You are carrying a terror you cannot look at, in a body you cannot trust, inside a hero system you did not choose and are not sure about. What you need, urgently and continuously, is the feeling that somebody knows, that there is competence somewhere, that the situation is under control even if not by you, and a large personality, a confident one, a person who seems unafraid, provides that, not by argument, by presence. So transference, in Becker's account, is not the patient regressing into a child. It is a mortal creature doing the only sensible thing available, which is locating the terror somewhere outside itself in a figure large enough to hold it. He calls this a taming of terror, and he insists against the whole tradition that it is not weakness, it is an appetite. It is what a self-conscious animal does with a fear it cannot metabolize alone, which changes what you are looking at when you see someone enthralled to a leader. The ordinary explanation is that followers are credulous, or stupid, or damaged, or looking for a father. The condescension in that explanation is doing a lot of work, and Becker removes it. On his account, the follower is not defective. The follower has a normal human need and has found a normal human solution. And the reason it is dangerous is not that it is abnormal. The reason it is dangerous is that it is completely normal and almost impossible to see from inside. Now watch what he does with this, because it goes somewhere uncomfortable. If transference is the solution to terror, then the strong figure is not being obeyed because they have power. They are being obeyed because obedience feels like safety, and the safety is real in the sense that the feeling is genuine and it does reduce the anxiety. This is why arguing with somebody about their leader does not work. You are offering information. They are defending an anxiety management system, and they will experience your information as an attack, which functionally it is. And it is why the strong figure does not have to be right or good or even coherent. The qualification for the role is not accuracy. It is the appearance of not being afraid. Certainty is the credential. Becker draws the political conclusion, and he does not soften it. He argues that the willingness of ordinary, decent, unfanatical people to hand themselves over to a leader and to feel relieved doing it is not a puzzle about propaganda or a failure of education. It is the ordinary transference appetite operating at scale, and it is available in any population at any time because the underlying condition is not historical, it is the human situation. There is a personal version of this that I think is more useful to most people than the political one, and it is the thing that makes this chapter land. Think about the last time you felt genuinely calmed by another person. Not entertained, calmed. A doctor who was unhurried. A colleague who looked at the disaster and said, "Right, here is what we do." A parent, when you were small, walking into a room, notice that the calm did not come from evidence. You did not verify anything. What you received was somebody else's apparent lack of fear, and your nervous system took it as a report about the world. That is the mechanism. It is running in you all the time, and it is why the most consequential quality a person can have in terms of the effect they have on others is not competence but composure. Composure transfers. It is also the easiest thing in the world to fake, and the people best at faking it are not usually the people you want deciding things. Becker is honest enough to admit he has painted himself into a corner here, and this is where the chapter gets interesting rather than merely clever. Because if transference is universal and necessary, then you cannot recommend that people stop doing it. That would be the same error as recommending that people live without a vital lie. He is not going to tell you to be your own authority, be self-sufficient, need no one, which is the standard advice, and which he regards as a fantasy of exactly the causa sui kind. The person who insists they answer to nobody has not escaped the mechanism. They have simply transferred onto themselves, which is the worst available object, because it is the one that dies. So what does he recommend? Very little. And what he does recommend is careful. He follows Otto Rank here, and the position is roughly this. Since you are going to project your need for something larger onto something, the only real question is the size and quality of what you choose. A transference onto a person is dangerous because a person is small, mortal, and can be disappointed, and when they fail, the whole structure comes down. A transference onto something genuinely large, which for Rank and for Becker means something at the scale of the cosmos or the ultimate, at least has an object big enough for the job. That is not a religious argument exactly, though it is standing very close to one, and by the last chapter of the book Becker is standing closer still. It is an argument about proportion. If you are going to put the weight somewhere, put it on something that can take it. And that sets up the next chapter, which takes the most common modern answer to that question and examines it, and which is, I think, the passage in this book most likely to be about your actual life. Because when the large objects lose their credibility, when the church is not available and the nation is embarrassing and the work is obviously just work, the need does not go away, it goes looking. And there is one object left standing, one thing modern people still believe is capable of redeeming a life, one place we are still permitted to invest an unlimited amount of ultimate significance without anybody calling it superstition. It is the person you are in love with. Part 6. The Romantic Solution. This section of the book is a few pages long. It is the part people remember. It is the part people send to each other, and in my judgment it is the most quietly devastating thing Becker wrote, because unlike the political material, it is almost certainly describing something you have done. The setup is the one we have just built. A person needs to feel that their existence is significant in some way that outlasts them. The large public systems that used to supply that feeling have weakened. The need has not weakened at all. So where does it go? Becker, following rank, says it goes into the love object. The urge towards self-expansion that once went to God now goes to another person. And the entire apparatus of ultimate meaning gets focused, without anybody deciding to do it, on one individual human being. And he does not hedge the formulation. The love object, he says, becomes the divine ideal within which to fulfill one's life. All the spiritual and moral needs now focus in one person. In one word, the love object is God. Now, before that sounds like a criticism of romance, understand what he thinks is genuinely being attempted, because he takes it seriously as a solution and not as a foolishness. What is wanted from the partner is not company, and not sex, and not even happiness. What is wanted is justification, the sense that your existence is validated at the deepest level by a consciousness outside yourself that has looked at all of you and found it worth something. That is a real hunger, and it is not adolescent. Becker calls it what it is. People want redemption, and they want it from a person because there is nowhere else left to ask. You can see how well designed the solution looks. Another person can see you. Another person can know the private, unimpressive, frightened material and stay anyway. Being fully known and not rejected is about as close as a human being gets to absolution, and no institution can deliver it, and a lover can. And it fails, structurally, not because people choose badly, and not because of poor communication, and not for any of the reasons the culture usually offers. It fails because of what the partner is. Becker's line is the one to hold on to. No human relationship can bear the burden of godhood. You have handed a mortal, limited, tired person the job of being the ground of your significance, and they cannot do it because they are the same kind of thing you are. And here is the cruel mechanism. And the reason this is not just a sentimental point about expectations. The whole purpose of the arrangement was to cancel your creatureliness, to be redeemed from being a perishable animal by the gaze of another. But your partner is themselves a perishable animal, and you are going to see it. You will see them ill. You will see them petty and tired and afraid of stupid things and unimpressive at 4 a.m. You will see them age, which means the person recruited to save you from mortality is going to keep providing you with evidence of mortality. They are the most intimate and unavoidable reminder of exactly the thing they were supposed to abolish. Becker's phrase is that the love object inevitably reflects earthly decay and imperfection. That is the trap, and it is closed. The better you know them, the worse they perform the function. Intimacy, which is the thing you wanted, is the solvent of the thing you wanted it for. And now a whole set of familiar behaviors becomes legible. And this is where I think the analysis earns its reputation. It explains the specific bitterness of disappointment in long relationships. Not disappointment in a person which would be proportionate and manageable, but a disappointment that has a metaphysical size to it, a sense of having been cheated by the universe. That size is the tell. Nobody is that angry about somebody being ordinary unless something enormous was riding on them not being. It explains why some people leave relationships that are, by any external account, good. The partner has not failed as a partner. The partner has failed as a god, which is a job they never applied for and were never told they had. And so the person leaves and looks again, and the new one glows because a stranger has not yet supplied the evidence. It explains the pursuit of the unavailable, which everyone recognizes and nobody can explain. On this account, the unavailable person is not a bad choice made by a damaged person. It is a rational choice by the machinery, because distance preserves divinity. What you want is an object that can carry the projection, and the only object that carries it indefinitely is one you never fully get. And it explains why people who have found the ideal partner sometimes report, quietly and with a lot of guilt, that it has not done what it was supposed to do, because nothing was ever going to. The problem was not the search, the problem was the specification. I want to be fair to Becker, and also fair to you here, because it would be easy to take this as a counsel of despair about love, and that is not what it is. Becker is not saying that love is an illusion or that intimacy is worthless. He is saying that a specific job has been assigned to it that it cannot do, and that a great deal of avoidable misery comes from the assignment rather than from the relationship. If you strip the redemptive function out, what is left is not nothing. What is left is two mortal creatures who know what the other one is and stay in the room. Becker would say that is a smaller thing than what people are asking for, and also that it is the actual thing, and that the actual thing is available. He would also say, and this is the part that is hard to hear, that the reason people cannot settle for that is not romantic idealism. It is that the smaller version does not solve the problem. It leaves you where you were, which is mortal and unjustified, and alone in the specific way that a self-conscious animal is alone. The demand for godhood in a partner is not greed. It is the accurate size of the whole. There is a period limitation here that I should flag, because the chapter has one. Becker is writing in the early 1970s, largely about heterosexual pairing, in the vocabulary of his moment, and there are places where his examples carry assumptions about men and women that have not aged and that a modern reader will stumble over. The structural argument does not depend on any of that, and it transfers without loss. But the furniture is dated, and pretending otherwise would be silly. So we have now watched two solutions fail. The strong person cannot hold the weight, because they are one person. The beloved cannot hold it, for the same reason plus proximity. There is a third solution, and it is the one that most people listening to this will find the most attractive. So I want to deal with it before we move on, because Becker deals with it, and his verdict is not what you would hope. The third solution is to make something. This is Rank's territory, from art and artist, and the logic of it is clean. If the problem is that you are a perishable animal, and if no other person can absolve you of that, then bypass people entirely, make an object, put the significance into a work rather than into a relationship, a book, a building, a body of research, a company, a piece of music. The work does not age, does not disappoint you, does not become ordinary at 4 a.m, and it can outlast you by centuries. Rank thought this was the highest and most conscious form of the Cosa Sui project. The artist is a person who has understood at some level that they must give birth to themselves, and who does it by producing a second self on the outside made of durable material. And then Rank identifies the flaw, and it is beautiful, and it is not the flaw you would predict. The problem is not that the work might fail. The problem is that the work has to be received, because an object dropped into the world is only an immortality vehicle if somebody else agrees that it is one. A book nobody reads does not confer significance. A painting in a locked room does not justify a life. So the maker, having gone to enormous trouble to escape depending on other people for their justification, has to hand the finished thing back to exactly those people and wait for a verdict, which means the artist has not escaped the transference at all. They have made it larger and slower and more public. The audience becomes the god, the judgment becomes the sacrament, and that is why the relationship between people who make things and the reception of the things they make is so consistently disproportionate, why a single dismissive review can do damage that no reasonable person would predict, and why success so often fails to deliver what it was supposed to deliver. The work was never the point. The verdict was the point. And a verdict is somebody else's, and you have just given a stranger the authority to decide whether your existence was justified. Becker's assessment is that this is the most impressive of the three solutions, and that it fails for the same structural reason as the others. It is finite. It depends on other finite things. It cannot do what it was recruited to do. Which raises the question the second half of the book is organized around. If the defenses are necessary and every available object is inadequate, what is actually down there? What is a person made of if you go through the layers in order? Becker takes that question from a therapist he admired, and the answer is a map with 4 levels on it, and the 4th one is the one this whole video has been about. Part 7. 4 layers down. Fritz Perls was a therapist, the founder of Gestalt therapy, working mostly in California in the 1960s, and he had a way of describing the structure of a neurotic personality as a set of layers stacked on top of each other. Becker takes it and uses it as the cross-section of everything he has been describing. You go down through it in order. You cannot skip. The first layer is the phony one. This is the ordinary social performance, the greetings, the small talk, the professional manner, the face you have for people you do not know. It is not sinister, and it is not hypocrisy in any interesting sense. It is the layer at which almost all of human interaction happens, and most people spend most of their lives entirely inside it and are perfectly all right. The second layer is the phobic one. This is the layer of what you do not want to look at about yourself. Not secrets exactly, the material you steer around. The suspicion that you are not as good at your job as people think, or that your kindness has a motive in it, or that a relationship in your life is not what you describe it as. Everybody knows roughly where their own second layer is, because you can feel yourself declining to go there. The third layer is the one Pearls called the impasse, and this one is harder to describe because it is not content, it is the absence of it. When a person goes past their defenses, what they find is not a set of buried truths. What they find is a kind of emptiness, a stuck place, a sense of nothing to push against and nowhere to stand. People describe it as feeling numb or dead or lost. It is not a discovery. It is the discovery that there is nothing where you expected the foundation. That is the layer that ends most of the journeys. It is unpleasant enough and unrewarding enough that people come back up. And underneath it, Pearl says, and Becker quotes, is the fourth layer. He calls it the death layer, or the implosive layer. And the description of it is one of the passages I would keep if I kept nothing else from this book. It is the layer of our true and basic animal anxieties. The terror that we carry around in our secret heart. That is the thing. That is what the whole structure is built over. Not repressed desire, not a wounded inner child, not a story about your parents, an animal that knows what it is. Now, why does this matter? Beyond being a vivid picture, it matters because it explains something that anybody who has done serious inner work of any kind will recognize, and that is usually misinterpreted. When people go looking for themselves, in therapy or in solitude or in whatever practice they use, they are usually expecting to find something, a truer self, a buried authenticity, the person they would have been. The culture is saturated with this expectation. Strip away the false, and the real is underneath. What they actually hit, over and over, is the impasse, the nothing. And because they were promised a something, they interpret the nothing as failure. They think they have not gone deep enough, or that they have chosen the wrong method, or that they are uniquely broken because everybody else apparently found their true self and they found a hole. Becker's account says the hole is the correct result. You have arrived exactly where the map says you would. There is no true self under the character structure, because the character structure was not covering a self, it was covering a terror. And between the covering and the terror there is a layer of nothing at all, which is what it feels like to be a symbolic animal with no story running. I find that genuinely useful. And I think it is the most practically valuable idea in the book because it converts a private sense of personal failure into a structural feature that everybody hits. But I want to put a boundary around it as well. Becker is describing a psychological topography from 1973, taken from a therapist whose methods were of their time. This is not a clinical model, and it is not a treatment plan, and it is certainly not a description of what is happening to any particular person. If somebody is in genuine distress, the correct response is a real professional and not a 50-year-old layer diagram. I am giving you Becker's picture because the picture is the argument. It is not advice. With that said, there is a second thing that falls out of the layer model, and it is the answer to a question people always ask about this book. The question is, if character is a lie and the truth is terror, is the goal to get to the bottom? Becker says no, and he says it with more force than anywhere else in the book. Nobody lives at the fourth layer. It is not habitable. The people who have been there involuntarily do not describe it as enlightenment. The whole purpose of the apparatus is that you do not have to stand in it, and a life spent trying to stand in it is not a deeper life. It is a life spent doing something that cannot be done. What he wants is something much more limited and I think much more honest. He wants you to know the architecture, not to demolish it, to know what floor you are standing on, and to know what is holding the floor up, and to notice when you are defending a structure rather than making an argument. That is a smaller ambition than most of the ideas this book gets attached to. It is also achievable, which they are not. There is one more idea in this region of the book that I think is the most immediately recognizable thing Becker wrote, and it explains a category of behavior that looks irrational from outside and is perfectly logical from inside. He calls it fetishization, and the ordinary word for it is narrowing. The problem, remember, is that the world is too large. A person is a small, perishable creature in a universe of unlimited size and unlimited possibility, and the anxiety that produces is not manageable. So the solution, which everybody uses to some degree, is to shrink the world down to a size you can control, and then to invest the shrunken version with all the significance the real one had. You take a piece of the world small enough to master, and you make it the whole of your concern. That is what a compulsion is on this account. Not a malfunction, but a solution, and a rather ingenious one. If everything depends on the sequence being done correctly, on the surfaces being clean, on the numbers coming out right, then you have converted an unbounded terror into a bounded task. And a bounded task can be completed. The relief is real, which is why the behavior persists. And the cost is that the world you can now live in is the size of a countertop. But Becker's point, and this is the part worth carrying, is that this is not a description of unusual people. It is a description of a universal move at different magnitudes. The person who is narrowed to a ritual is doing at one scale what a person who is narrowed to their career is doing at another, and what a person who is narrowed to a single relationship or a single grievance or a single political certainty or the maintenance of one house is doing at another. In every case, a manageable fragment has been made to stand in for an unmanageable whole, and in every case the intensity of the investment is a measure of how much anxiety is being handled by it. Which is why you cannot talk somebody out of a narrow life by pointing out that it is narrow. The narrowness is the feature. It is what makes the life livable. Offering somebody a wider world is not offering them a gift. It is offering them the thing their whole arrangement exists to keep out. I find that a genuinely useful correction to a lot of well-meaning advice. When somebody's world has become very small, the ordinary instinct is to encourage them outward and to be baffled when they resist. Becker's account says the resistance is not stubbornness. You are asking a person to remove a wall, and the wall is not decorative. There is one more consequence, and it is the bridge into the next section. If the layers are stacked in that order, then everything above the fourth layer is load-bearing, which means that a person whose defenses are working is standing on something, and a person whose defenses stop working is not standing on anything and does not fall a short distance. They fall the whole way. Becker's account of what that looks like: when the causa sui project stops delivering and the hero system stops convincing and the transference objects have all been used up, is the most contested part of this book, and I am going to be careful how I present it, because he is doing something in that chapter that a modern reader has every right to push back on. He is going to tell you what he thinks depression is. Part 8. When the project fails. I want to set the terms of this section before I start it, because I'm about to describe a 1970s theorist's account of mental illness, and there is a way of hearing that which would be wrong and would do harm. What follows is Ernest Becker's reading. It is not a clinical model, it is not a diagnosis of anybody, and it is not an alternative to treatment. Becker was an anthropologist, writing before most of the modern research existed, and the field has moved a very long way since. I am presenting it because it is central to his book and because it contains one genuine insight. I am not presenting it as true about your life or anybody's. With that said, here it is. Becker's chapter is called A General View of Mental Illness, and his organizing claim is that the conditions psychiatry treats as separate diseases can be looked at, from his angle, as different ways of failing at the same task. The task is the causa sui project. The task is to sustain a workable sense that your existence is significant. And his reading of depression, which he discusses using the older word melancholia and the language of his period, goes like this. When a person is depressed, the hero project has stopped working. The thing they were doing in order to matter has stopped delivering the feeling of mattering, and because the whole apparatus was built to keep the terror out of view, its failure does not merely produce sadness, it produces exposure. The person is being reminded continuously of exactly the thing the structure existed to hide, which is their own smallness and impermanence. And then he adds the observation that I think is the real content of the chapter, and the reason it is worth repeating at all. He points out how often the person is trapped in a role they cannot leave, not physically trapped. Trapped in the sense that the identity is the only one they have, that everything they are rests on continuing to be that, and that they cannot see a version of themselves on the other side of giving it up. So they stay, and the role no longer works, and they cannot leave it, and that is the vice. I think that observation survives, independent of the theory around it. Anybody who has watched a person stay in a marriage or a job or a family position or a public identity, long after it stopped giving them anything, has watched the thing Becker is pointing at. The reason they stay is not usually that they cannot imagine an alternative arrangement. It is that they cannot imagine being a person at all outside the one they have got. Now here is what is wrong with the chapter, and it needs saying clearly. Becker is writing before the modern evidence base, and his account has no serious place in it for biology, for genetics, for the effects of illness and poverty and violence and isolation, or for the enormous body of work that has accumulated since on how depression actually behaves and what actually helps. Reading a 1973 existential account as though it were a competing explanation of clinical depression would be a category error. It is a piece of philosophical anthropology about meaning, not a medical claim, and when it strays toward being a medical claim, it is simply out of date. What is worth keeping is narrow and real, meaning collapse is a thing that happens to people. The loss of a role can be experienced as annihilation and not merely as change. And the intensity of that experience is not irrational, because on Becker's account something genuinely load-bearing has gone. Now let me give you the piece of theory that sits underneath this, because it is the most elegant thing in the second half of the book, and it comes from Otto Rank. Rank said that a human being is caught between two fears, and he called them life fear and death fear. Death fear is the one we have been discussing. The fear of ending, of being extinguished, of the body's schedule. Life fear is subtler, and Rank thought it was just as powerful. It is the fear of standing out, of separating, of being an individual, on your own account, exposed, responsible, with nothing to hide behind. Life fear is what makes a person shrink from their own possibility, decline the opportunity, stay smaller than they are. And these two fears pull in opposite directions, which is the whole point. If you move toward merging into the group, the family, the tradition, the shared belief, the relationship, you get relief from life fear. You are held, you are not exposed. But you pay for it by losing your separate claim to existence. You disappear into the larger thing, and some part of you registers that as a death of its own. If you move toward individuating, standing out, making your own claim, being singular, you get relief from death fear, because you have made yourself a distinct and memorable thing. But now you are alone in the exact way that terrified you, unsupported, without the group, and you have to justify your existence by yourself permanently. So there is no correct position. There is no arrangement that answers both. Every human life is a negotiated settlement between two fears that cannot both be satisfied, and neurosis, in Rank's sense and Becker's, is what you get when the settlement is bad in one direction or the other. I find this the most humane idea in the book, and it is the antidote to a great deal of nonsense. Because the culture is full of advice that assumes one of these is the answer. Be yourself. Stand out. Do not conform. Live your truth. Or, alternatively, you are not that special. Belong to something. Serve. Submit to a tradition. Both of these are being sold as solutions. Constantly, usually by people who have made money from one of them. On Rank's account, they are not solutions. They are the two directions you can move, and each purchases relief from one fear at the cost of aggravating the other, and the person selling you either one is selling half a trade as though it were a whole answer. Which means the reason you feel pulled in both directions is not that you are indecisive or unresolved, or not yet self-actualized. It is that you are correctly reading a situation that has two incompatible costs in it. And there is a corollary that I think is worth stating on its own, because people find it a relief. If both moves are compromises, then the well-adjusted person is not the person who found the answer. They are the person whose compromise happens to fit the shape of the world they live in, change the world around them, and the same settlement stops working. Which is why people who were fine for 20 years come apart when they move country, or retire, or lose a role, and cannot explain what changed. Nothing changed in them. The environment that made their particular compromise workable went away. That is Becker's account of failure. A project that stops delivering, a role that cannot be left, and two fears with no position that satisfies both. Now, we leave the theory because in 1986, 3 social psychologists read this book and asked a question that Becker never got to ask, and would probably have enjoyed enormously. They asked whether any of it could be tested. Part 9. 22 Judges. Becker died in 1974. 12 years later, 3 social psychologists, Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pishinsky, published the first version of a theory built directly on his book. They called it Terror Management Theory. I want to be exact about the chronology, because people get this wrong in both directions. Becker never saw a single one of these experiments. He never commented on them, never endorsed them, never had the chance to object to how his ideas were operationalized. Everything in this section happened after he was dead, and it is the work of people reading him, not of him. Their problem was the one I raised in Part 1. Becker's claim is that a hidden terror is doing enormous work in ordinary behavior. If the terror is hidden, how do you ever see it? Their solution is elegant. You cannot observe the fear directly, but if the theory is right, you can nudge it, and the nudge should produce a measurable change in behavior that has nothing obviously to do with death. So the design is always the same shape. Take 2 groups, give one of them a brief reminder of their own mortality, usually 2 open questions about what will happen to them physically when they die and what the thought makes them feel. Give the other group a parallel task about something else, unpleasant but not fatal. Then insert a distraction, because the effect is supposed to work below awareness and not while people are consciously thinking about it. Then measure something entirely unrelated. and see whether the two groups differ. That is the design that produced the judges, and now you can see what the judges were actually testing. The prediction was not that reminding people of death makes them harsh. The prediction was more specific and much stranger. It was that a mortality reminder makes people cling harder to their own cultural worldview, because on Becker's account, the worldview is the immortality vehicle, so they should reward people who uphold it and punish people who violate it more than they otherwise would. Which is why the case was chosen as it was. It is a case where somebody has broken a shared moral standard rather than harmed a specific victim. If the theory is right, a mortality-reminded judge is not simply in a bad mood. They are defending a structure. 22 of the 24 judges returned the materials, $50 against $455, and again, none of them experienced it as anything other than legal reasoning. That result launched one of the larger research programs in social psychology. Its authors count more than 500 experiments. The reported findings run across an enormous range of behavior, and the pattern is always the same shape: nudge mortality, and people become more attached to whatever it is that makes them feel significant, and more hostile to whatever threatens it. Now here is the part almost no video on this book will tell you, and it is the reason I said at the start that the honest answer is more interesting than the tidy one. Over the last 15 years, psychology has been through a reckoning about whether its famous findings actually hold up when other people run them. A great many classic effects have not survived, and terror management theory has been in the middle of that reckoning. The most serious challenge is a project called Many Labs 4. 17 separate laboratories, more than 1,500 participants, after exclusions, all attempting to replicate a classic mortality salience result. Half the labs used protocols developed with the involvement of the original authors, which was the clever part of the design. The idea was to test whether the effect needs the original researchers' expertise to appear. The result was that they could not produce the effect under either condition, not with the original author's input and not without it. Which means the study could not even answer the question it was designed to answer because there was no effect to explain. The defenders of the theory have answers, and some of them are substantive. The main one is that the replication deviated from its own pre-registered plan and ran samples smaller than the plan specified, which undercuts the point of pre-registering. There are also arguments about whether the particular measure chosen was the right one, and about whether the conditions that produce the effect are more fragile than the literature suggested. So where does that leave us? I am going to give you my honest reading and label it as mine. The most confident version of terror management theory, the one where a 2-minute writing task reliably reshapes judgment in any population, is not in good shape. Anybody telling you the judge's study is simply established science is overstating it, and the fact that this study is quoted constantly, including by me 20 minutes ago, is itself an example of how a striking result travels further than its evidential weight. But notice what is and is not at stake. Terror management theory is one attempt to operationalize Becker. It is not Becker. His book is a work of interpretation, and it stands or falls on whether it makes sense of things that otherwise do not make sense, not on whether a particular laboratory manipulation produces a particular effect size. If every mortality salience experiment failed tomorrow, the argument about character as a vital lie would be exactly where it was in 1973, undemonstrated, which is where it always was. And that cuts the other way too, and I want to be even-handed about it. The experiments were the best available answer to the objection that this theory cannot be tested. If they are in trouble, the objection comes back, and it comes back stronger, because we now know what happened when people tried. So the fair summary is this. Becker wrote a powerful interpretive framework that explains a great deal and predicts very little. A generation of researchers tried to convert it into a predictive science and got a large, striking, influential body of results whose reliability is now genuinely uncertain. Both of those things are true at once. And a video that gave you only the first would be selling you a book, and one that gave you only the second would be missing why anybody cared. I said earlier that Becker himself would have wanted it put this way, and I want to justify that rather than just assert it. In the last chapter of the book, he says that the proper test of any faith, any worldview, is whether it can contain the fundamental contradictions of the human situation rather than papering over them. A framework that cannot survive being told about its own weak points is, by his own standard, a hero system rather than an argument. He set that trap himself. It would be poor manners to walk him around it. There is one more thing to take from the experimental tradition, and it does not depend on any contested result. The design of these studies contains an assumption so ordinary that nobody remarks on it, and it is Becker's whole thesis smuggled in as a laboratory convention. The standard paradigm puts a delay and a distraction between the death reminder and the measurement as a matter of routine. It is there because the researchers found early and consistently that measuring while people are still consciously thinking about death gives you a different result, or none. The effect they were chasing requires that the thought has left awareness first. Whatever you conclude about the effect sizes, that is a striking methodological fact, and it is exactly the shape Becker said the thing would have. Not a fear you feel, a fear that does its work once you have stopped looking at it. And now we go to the other book, the one he wrote while he was dying, that he did not finish, and where this stops being an argument about your anxiety. Part 10. Escape from Evil. There is a second book. It was published in 1975, a year after Becker died, and he had not finished it. It is called Escape from Evil, and it is where the argument stops being about your private anxiety and becomes something much harder to sit with. It opens with a line from Thomas Hardy. If a way to the better there be, it lies in taking a full look at the worst. That is a statement of method, and he means it. Here is the question the second book asks. If the immortality project is what human beings are doing all the time, and if it is normal and necessary and not a pathology, then where does organized human cruelty come from? Not the cruelty of damaged individuals, which is a small problem numerically. The other kind. The kind that requires paperwork and enthusiasm and ordinary people going to work. The standard answers were all available to him. That evil comes from aggression, from a death instinct, from scarcity, from ideology, from the failure of civilizing restraints, from a few pathological leaders and a passive population. Becker rejects all of them, and his answer is the most disturbing sentence in his work, and I want to state it as plainly as I can. Evil is not the failure of the Immortality Project. Evil is the Immortality Project working. Follow the logic, because it is tight. Your sense that your existence matters is not freestanding. It comes from a hero system, a shared account of what makes a life significant. That account is not privately yours. It is held in common with other people. And its authority comes precisely from being held in common, from being obviously and universally true. Now put in front of that system a group of people who live by a different one, who are not miserable, who are not obviously wrong, who have their own account of what a significant life is, and who are getting on with it. What have they done to you? On the surface, nothing. They have not attacked you, taken anything, or made an argument. But they have demonstrated that your account is one of several, and on Becker's reading, that is not an intellectual inconvenience. It is a threat to the structure that is holding down your terror. The existence of a functioning alternative is evidence that yours is a construction, and the whole value of it depended on it not being a construction. So the other group is experienced as dangerous, not disliked, dangerous. And the response is not to argue, because the problem is not a disagreement. The response is to remove the evidence. And here is the turn that makes it appalling. The removal does not feel like cruelty from inside. It feels like duty. It feels like protecting something precious. Becker's line is that the highest heroism becomes the stamping out of those who are tainted. The person doing it is not experiencing themselves as a monster. They are experiencing themselves as a hero, which is exactly what the theory says they need to be, and the entire machinery of significance is now pointed at the destruction of other people and is supplying the good feeling all the way through. That is the scapegoat mechanism, as Becker describes it. You purchase your own significance by identifying something that must be eliminated for the world to be right, and the elimination is the proof of your commitment, and the commitment is the immortality, which means, on this account, that the most destructive force in human history is not hatred or greed or indifference. It is the need to feel that your life means something, operating normally in a population that is frightened. I said in the first part of this video that Becker's biography is not decoration. Here is where it stops being decoration. He was 19 or 20 years old, an American infantryman, and he was among the soldiers involved in the liberation of a Nazi concentration camp. Whatever he saw when the gates came open, he saw before he had any framework to put it in. and then he spent his professional life constructing an account of human motivation whose central claim is that this is not an aberration produced by uniquely evil people. It is what the ordinary need for significance does when it is frightened and organized. He is not saying everybody is a murderer. He is saying the machinery is standard equipment, and that the difference between a population that uses it to build cathedrals and one that uses it for atrocity is not a difference in the machinery. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets flattened into something either useless or offensive. It is not a claim that everyone is equally culpable, and it is not an excuse. Becker is not offering absolution to anybody. Explaining a mechanism is not forgiving what runs on it, and he says so. The point of the analysis is the opposite of exculpation. If atrocity required monsters, you would be safe, because you are not one. If it runs on the same equipment that makes people love their country and their work and their families, then you are not safe. And neither is anybody. And the only protection available is knowing what the equipment is. There is also a serious limitation, and I will name it. This is a single mechanism explanation of an enormous and varied historical phenomenon. And single mechanism explanations of history are almost always too simple. Historians of these events will tell you about bureaucratic structure, obedience, economic interest, careerism, opportunism, propaganda, and the specific institutional design that made participation easy. Becker's account does not compete with those. At best, it sits underneath them and explains why the raw material was available. Anybody presenting it as the explanation is doing something he did not do. The second book is also, and this matters, unfinished. He was dying while he wrote it, he knew it, and it was published from what he had. It is more compressed, more assertive, less careful with its qualifications than The Denial of Death, and some of that is a dying man running out of time rather than a thinker in full command. Read it as the direction he was traveling in, not as a finished destination. But the direction is unmistakable, and the two books together make a single argument that I think is the reason he still gets read. The first book says the terror of death produces the self. The second says the same terror, at scale, produces history. And in both cases, the mechanism is not malfunction. It is the thing working as designed. The vital lie keeps the individual upright. The shared vital lie keeps the society upright. And when a shared lie is threatened, the people inside it will do whatever is required to keep it standing, and they will feel righteous the entire time. There is a version of this idea that is now everywhere in a degraded form, in the language of tribalism and echo chambers and identity, usually deployed to explain why the other side is irrational. Becker's version does not permit that use. On his account, you are not observing the mechanism from outside. There is no outside. The certainty you feel when you look at the people who are obviously wrong is the mechanism reporting in from the inside in your voice. That is as far as Becker goes on the political side, and it is where most treatments of him stop. But there is a last chapter in the first book, and it is the one where a dying man has to say what, if anything, follows from all of this. It is called Psychology and Religion, and it asks what a heroic individual would actually be. It does not go where you would expect. Part 11. The case against the book. I promised at the beginning that I would tell you where this argument is weak, and I want to do it properly rather than as a gesture. There are 4 serious objections. 2 of them I think Becker survives. 2 of them I think land. The first is the one I raised in part 1 and have been carrying since. The theory cannot be falsified. If a person is anxious about death, that confirms it. If they are not anxious, that confirms it too, because the absence is the repression. If somebody spends their life building a monument, that is an immortality project. If somebody renounces everything and lives in a hut, that is also an immortality project of the humility variety. If a culture is obsessed with the afterlife, that is death denial. If a culture never mentions death, that is death denial. There is no observation that comes out the other way. A framework that accommodates every possible outcome is not making a prediction, it is offering an interpretation. And the 2 are different things with different rights. The experiments in part 9 were the attempt to fix this, and their present condition means the problem is still open. I think this objection lands, and I do not think it destroys the book, and I want to be precise about the distinction. There are frameworks in the human sciences that are not falsifiable and are still worth having, because their value is that they make a mass of otherwise disconnected behavior intelligible. Becker's does that better than almost anything else in its neighborhood. But intelligibility is not evidence, and a reader who takes this book as having established something about human motivation has misunderstood what kind of book it is. The second objection is reductionism, and it is the one raised most often by people inside existential psychology rather than outside it. Becker takes death anxiety to be the master motive, the thing underneath everything, and a reasonable person can ask, why that one? Irvin Yalom, working in the same tradition a few years later, argued that there are 4 ultimate concerns and not one. Death is one of them, but so is freedom. In the vertiginous sense of being responsible with no external justification, so is isolation, the unbridgeable gap between one consciousness and another. So is meaninglessness. On that account, Becker has taken one member of a family and promoted it to the head of the household. And you can feel the strain in places. When Becker explains status competition as death denial, or lover's death denial, or scientific ambition as death denial, there is a point at which the explanation is doing less work than it appears to, because a concept that explains every motivation stops distinguishing between them. If everything is death anxiety, then saying that something is death anxiety tells you nothing about it. I think this objection lands as well, and it is the more damaging of the 2. Because it does not merely say the theory is untestable. It says the theory may be over-unified, that it may be one real motive wearing the clothes of all the others. The third objection is that the book is a product of its period in ways that are not merely cosmetic. It is written in a psychoanalytic idiom that has largely been abandoned. Its picture of childhood is reconstruction rather than research. Its examples carry the assumptions of a particular time and place about men and women. It generalizes from a modern Western condition in which the traditional hero systems have collapsed to the human condition as such, and it does that without much evidence from anywhere else. Anthropologists have pointed out that a good many societies do not organize their relationship to death anything like the way Becker's model assumes, and he was an anthropologist, so that criticism has some sting to it. I think this one is real but survivable in the sense that the structural argument can be lifted out of the dated furniture without breaking. It does mean you should be suspicious whenever he says human beings and means people in his own century. The fourth objection is the one people raise most often in ordinary conversation, and it is the one I think fails. The objection is that the book is nihilistic, that it tells you your personality is a lie, your love is a projection, your work is a monument against nothing, your convictions are terror management, and then offers no way out, that it is corrosive, that it takes things away and puts nothing back, and that a person is worse off for having read it. I do not think that is right, and the reason is in the structure of the argument rather than in its mood. Becker is not saying your love is nothing. He is saying a specific job has been assigned to it that it cannot do. He is not saying your work is worthless. He is saying it is carrying a weight it was not built for. He is not saying your convictions are false. He is saying that the intensity with which you hold them is not evidence of their truth, which is a claim about you and not about them. In every case, the move is the same. Not, this thing is worthless, but this thing is not load-bearing in the way you think it is, and knowing that will change how you hold it. And in practice, the effect of that on a reader is not usually despair. It is a kind of loosening. If the reason you cannot stand being wrong is that being right is where your solidity is stored, then seeing the mechanism does not make you a person who enjoys being wrong. It makes the stakes visible, and the stakes turn out to be lower than they felt. If the reason your partner keeps disappointing you is that you assigned them godhood, then that is not a reason to leave. It is a reason to notice what you are asking for. A person who has genuinely absorbed this book is not less able to love, work, and believe. They are, if anything, slightly less brittle about all three, because they know what the brittleness was made of. So, my honest summary. The book is not science and should not be read as science. Its master claim is probably too strong and its evidence is contested. Its period assumptions need translating, and it remains the best single account I know of a set of behaviors that other frameworks describe without explaining, and its central image, that character is a defense against a knowledge the defense exists to keep from you, is one of the few ideas in 20th century psychology that changes what you see when you go back out into the world. Which brings us to the last chapter, and to a problem Becker had that nobody has solved. He has spent 300 pages establishing that human beings require an immortality project, that all the available ones are inadequate, and that the honest position is to know this, and a reader gets to the end and asks the obvious question, so what do I do? He knew the question was coming. The chapter is his attempt to answer it, and the reason it is remembered is that he refuses at the last moment to give the answer that would have made the book comfortable. Coda, the offering. The last chapter of The Denial of Death is called Psychology and Religion, and it asks what the heroic individual actually is. Becker starts by disposing of the answer his own century preferred, which is that the answer is therapy. That a person can be worked on until the defenses are understood and released, and what emerges is a free, self-possessed individual who does not need illusions. He does not think this is possible, and his reason is the whole book. There is no self under the character structure to be liberated. The therapy that promises it is offering a causa sui project in clinical language, the fantasy of a person who is the author of themselves, which is the oldest illusion in the catalogue, wearing a professional coat. He is polite about it. He is not remotely persuaded. And then he does something that surprised his readers, and that some of them never forgave. He turns toward religion, not to any particular one, and not with a conversion, and not with any claim that it is true. What he says is structural. If a human being requires an object large enough to absorb the terror, and if every finite object is too small, then the only candidate of the right size is the infinite one. Whether or not it exists is a separate question, and he does not answer it. He is making an argument about the dimensions of the whole. He then puts a test on it, and this is the sentence I find most characteristic of him. The proper measure of any faith, he says, is whether it can hold the fundamental contradictions of the human situation inside itself rather than smoothing them away. A worldview that makes you comfortable has failed the test. A worldview that lets you keep the paradox, the God-sized consciousness in the perishable body without resolving it in either direction, is doing the only thing that can honestly be done. By his own criterion, that is a very hard test to pass, and he does not claim to have passed it. Which leaves the ending, and the ending of this book is 4 lines long, and it is the whole of his practical advice. He says that the most any of us seems able to do is to fashion something, an object or ourselves, and drop it into the confusion and make an offering of it to the life force. Read that carefully, because every word of it is doing something. Fashion something. So you still make. The immortality project is not cancelled, and he is not telling you to stop building. Building is what the animal does, an object or ourselves. So the thing you make can be the person you become. That is allowed, and it is the same activity. Drop it into the confusion, not into a system, not into a scheme, not into a plan that guarantees the thing will land somewhere and be counted, into confusion. He is explicit that you do not get to know what it was for, and make an offering of it, which is the word that changes the sentence. An offering is given without a receipt. You do not offer something in exchange for a result. The whole meaning of the word is that the value of the act does not depend on what comes back. That is it. That is the prescription at the end of a book that has spent 300 pages taking apart every consolation available to a modern person. Make something, including possibly yourself. Let go of it. Do not require that it be counted. It is almost nothing. It is also, as far as I can tell, the only thing left standing after his own argument, and the fact that he did not inflate it into something more satisfying is the reason I trust him. Let me finish with the man, because the timing of all of this is not a coincidence, and it is the part of the story that no summary of the ideas can carry. He was diagnosed with colon cancer in November of 1972. The book came out in 1973, which means that the argument you have just spent 2.5 hours with, the argument that no human being can hold the knowledge of their own death in ordinary consciousness, was being finished and published by a man who was doing exactly that, on a schedule, with a date attached. In February of 1974, a writer named Sam Kean came to his hospital room in Vancouver to interview him for a magazine. Becker greeted him by saying that Kean was catching him in extremis, and that this was the test of everything he had written about death. He knew exactly what the situation was. He said, in effect, that the theory was now going to be examined under the only conditions that count. The interview ran in Psychology Today, days after he died, on the 6th of March, 1974. He was 49. 2 months after that, the denial of death was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. He never knew the one piece of unambiguous cultural validation his work ever received. The Immortality Project, delivering exactly what an immortality project is supposed to deliver, arrived at an address where there was no longer anybody to sign for it. I do not think that is ironic, and I do not want to leave you with it as an irony, because it is better than that. It is the argument demonstrated. He had said all along that the significance does not come back to you, that you drop the thing into the confusion and you do not get to see where it lands, that the offering is only an offering if there is no receipt. He wrote a book saying that, and then the book proved it by arriving on the other side of him. The last thing worth saying is about what the book did afterwards, which is the only kind of afterlife his own argument allows for. It went into a film in 1977, handed across a bookshop counter by a comedian, which is how most people first heard the title. It produced a research program that has run for 40 years and is currently arguing about itself in public, which is what a live idea looks like. It sits on shelves belonging to people who have never read a word of Freud, and it is being discussed right now by someone who was not born when he died, none of which he experienced, all of which is the offering still in the confusion, still not counted. If you take one thing out of this, I would not make it the Immortality Project or the Vital Lie, useful as those are. I would make it the small thing underneath them. You are carrying a structure. It was built early, out of materials you did not choose, for a reason you were never told. It is holding you up. Most of the time, it is doing its job, and there is no call to interfere with it. But when you next find yourself unable to be wrong about something small, or furious at a person for being ordinary, or certain in a way that has heat in it out of all proportion to the subject, you now have a second question available to you, and it is not what is wrong with them. It is, what is this holding up? Thank you for staying for the whole thing. If you want the companion to it, the video on Camus and living without meaning takes the same problem and refuses a different set of consolations, and the two of them argue with each other in a way I think is worth hearing. Sleep well or do not. That was always the point.